The space station hummed with quiet energy as human explorer Derek sat at the control console, his fingers dancing across the buttons with practiced ease, navigating the vast expanse of the intergalactic event. He had been sent to attend the summit was a rare opportunity for Earth's representatives to engage with the most influential alien species in the galaxy, and Derek knew that it was his chance to make a meaningful impression, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. When the message had arrived inviting him to meet the rulers of a powerful and ancient alien civilization, he had barely hesitated to accept his mission. A diplomatic handshake was all that was needed, they had said, to seal the cooperation between worlds, and Derek had always prided himself on his ability to handle delicate situations. As he approached the grand hall, a sense of awe washed over him. The place was unlike anything he had ever seen, its architecture beyond human comprehension, smooth surfaces gleaming under the soft light from distant stars that filtered through massive transparent walls. The air was thick with an energy that made his skin tingle as he walked past species of every shape and size, each one more exotic and unfamiliar than the last. Their conversations blended into a chorus of foreign languages and unfamiliar sounds, but it all felt strangely harmonious, as though the universe had brought them all together for this one pivotal moment. Derek was greeted by a guide, an alien of a species that seemed to shimmer with a subtle glow, its eyes black as night, but deep with an intelligence that sent a ripple of nervousness through him. He was led into the heart of the hall, where a long table stretched before him, and the representatives of several alien civilizations were seated, but his attention was immediately drawn to one figure standing at the center of it all. The princess of the alien empire. Her beauty was otherworldly, the skin of her face a deep violet that shimmered like the night sky, her eyes wide and filled with curiosity as she regarded the human. Her hair, like liquid silver, cascaded down her back, and her presence radiated with a power that Derek could not place. The guide motioned for Derek to approach, and before he could speak, the princess took a step forward, her gaze never leaving him. She extended her hand toward him, her fingers delicate yet firm, with an invitation that Derek could not resist. He hesitated for only a moment, unsure of the alien customs. But then he placed his hand in hers. As their fingers touched, a sudden shock coursed through him. It was as though the very fabric of reality had bent for that brief second. Their touch was an exchange of something far greater than just a handshake. It was a bond, it was a promise, a connection that no human could have understood in that moment. The room fell silent, and Derek pulled back his hand quickly, as though the shock had been too much. But it was too late. The deed was done. The princess's eyes widened, and she looked at her father, the emperor, standing behind her, his gaze piercing and filled with an unreadable emotion. The emperor stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding echoed throughout the hall, addressing Derek as if he had already made a decision for the human without him even speaking. "You have done it." The emperor's voice resonated with power. "The bond has been sealed between our worlds, and now you will fulfill your destiny. You will marry my daughter, and you will become the father of the royal heir. Together, you will lead our people into a new age." Derek stood frozen, unable to process the words that had just been spoken. The princess, who had previously been so poised, now seemed to blush slightly as she turned her gaze toward the floor. Derek could not speak. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Why had the handshake triggered something like this? Was this some kind of mistake? Or was it an ancient custom that he had no way of understanding? Yet the emperor's gaze was unyielding, his demand clear as day. "You will be the father of our future. You will lead us together." The emperor repeated, his voice no longer just a command, but a decree Derek could not escape from. Derek stood there in a daze, the weight of the emperor's words crashing down on him, his heart racing as his mind struggled to keep up with the gravity of the situation. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. No protocol, no briefing, no manual on how to handle the political intricacies of an alien species who saw a handshake as more than just a greeting, but a sacred bond, a promise to unite their futures. As he tried to process the demand, his eyes darted to the princess. She stood quietly beside her father, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Derek question everything. She was not afraid or resentful, but resigned to this fate. Her gaze met his for a fleeting second, And in that moment, he saw the weight of expectation that had been placed on her shoulders and now on his. The Emperor stood tall, his imposing figure casting a shadow over Derek, but it wasn't just his physical presence that commanded attention, it was his aura of power, his centuries-old rule over an empire stretching across countless star systems, and his eyes held a sharpness that no human could ever match. Derek felt small in that moment, insignificant in the face of this ancient ruler who spoke as though his will was the law of the universe, as though fate itself had already been decided for him. And the Princess Derek tried to find his voice, but the words wouldn't come. The gravity of the situation rendered him speechless. The silence lingered for what felt like an eternity before the princess spoke, her voice soft yet clear like the chime of a distant bell. "You have no choice," she said simply. Her words were not harsh, they carried an undeniable truth. Derek could not deny her words. The Emperor's decree hung over him like a sword ready to fall, and he knew that refusing wasn't an option, not if he wanted to leave the summit alive, and not if he wanted to maintain any semblance of diplomatic relations between their worlds. He turned to look at the princess again. Her eyes held a depth he could not understand, a mix of resignation and something else, something deeper, a silent plea that he couldn't quite place. Was she afraid of what this bond meant for her future, or was she just as trapped by the customs of her people as he felt in that moment? "What do you want from me?" Derek finally managed to croak, his voice raw and uncertain. The Emperor's gaze didn't waver as he looked at the human, as if seeing right through him, as though he already knew the answer. "You will marry my daughter," the Emperor declared, his voice absolute, "and together you will father the royal heir. Your union will be the key to our people's survival. Our lineage cannot be interrupted, and you have already sealed it with your touch. Your presence here has bound you to us and to her." Derek wanted to protest, he wanted to argue that he had not agreed to anything, that this was all a misunderstanding, but the Emperor's words rang with such finality that he knew deep down that there was no room for negotiation in this alien culture. This was the way things were done here. A handshake was no simple formality, it was a contract, one that could not be broken without dire consequences. The princess stood silently by her father's side, her hand lightly resting on her stomach, as if she had already accepted the fate laid out before her. Derek could feel the tension rising in the air, an unspoken understanding between them that their futures were now tied together. Whether either of them liked it or not, he wanted to ask her what she thought about all of this, but the words stuck in his throat as the Emperor's gaze returned to him. "This is your path now." The Emperor's voice was a low rumble. "You will leave this summit as part of our family, and you will never return to your world again unless it is to bring us the unity we need." The weight of those words hit Derek like a physical blow as he tried to process the full extent of what was being asked of him. His life had just been irrevocably altered, and he had no idea how to navigate the treacherous waters of alien politics, or what role he was meant to play in this grand scheme. But one thing was certain: he had been thrust into a destiny that was not his own, and now he had to decide whether to embrace it or face the consequences. Derek's mind raced as the Emperor's words echoed in his ears. It was like being thrown into the deep end of an ocean without any way to swim. The realization hit him hard. He had no idea what the customs of this alien species entailed, and what being the royal heir's father meant in practical terms. He didn't know how to navigate their complex politics, or even how to prepare for something as monumental as becoming a prince consort of an alien empire. His life had just been ripped from its foundation, and now he was expected to stand on a new path with a new set of rules, a set of rules he knew nothing about. The princess remained silent beside him, her posture straight and composed, yet there was something in her eyes, something that Derek couldn't read. But he knew that she wasn't entirely at peace with what had just transpired. The weight of her father's expectations pressed down on her too, and Derek could see it now more clearly than before, the quiet suffering of someone who had never been given a choice, but to follow the path laid out for them by birthright. It was a harsh reality, a cruel thing to realize that she might not have any say in her own life, no more than Derek did in his own. The bond had been sealed between them by an act neither of them fully understood, and now they were bound by it. Derek glanced around the grand hall again, taking in the sight of the other delegates. Some of them were whispering among themselves, their eyes occasionally glancing toward him, and the princess, their stares filled with curiosity and perhaps amusement. As they watched the unfolding drama, it wasn't lost on Derek that this moment was more than just a personal crisis for him. It was a political spectacle unfolding before the eyes of some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Their whispers carried weight. They could make or break his future here with a single comment. But it was clear now that nothing would change. The Emperor had made his decision. The princess finally spoke, her voice low and careful. "You do not understand," she said softly. Her words were not a reproach, but a quiet statement of fact. Derek turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for answers. But all he saw was the same unreadable expression that she had worn since the moment. They met, the silence stretched between them as she seemed to consider her next words before continuing. "This is not just about you or me. This is about our people. The future of my empire depends on this bond. Our survival depends on it." Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to wrap his mind around her words. She spoke with a conviction that he couldn't ignore. The weight of her responsibility was now clear. She wasn't just some princess caught up in the whims of her father. She was a leader burdened by the survival of her entire civilization. Derek couldn't help but feel a surge of sympathy for her. But that didn't change the fact that he was now a part of this strange and alien world, whether he wanted to be or not. "So, what am I supposed to do?" Derek asked, his voice strained. "Just accept that my life is no longer my own, that I'm supposed to father your heir and live here forever without any say in what happens next." The princess's expression softened slightly as she reached out a hand to him, her fingers brushing lightly against his. "You have no choice," she said. "But that does not mean that you are powerless in this situation. You are part of something much bigger now, and the choices we make together will shape the future of this empire." Derek took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. He had no way of knowing what the future held, but it was clear now that he had been swept into something far beyond his understanding, something that would force him to grow and adapt in ways he couldn't imagine. And as much as he wanted to fight back against the tide of fate, he realized that he was already too far in to turn back. The Emperor stepped forward again, his voice once more cutting through the tension. "You will marry my daughter within the week. The ceremony will be held here on this station, where your bond will be recognized by all and the future of my people will be secured." His gaze was unwavering as he looked at Derek. "Failure to comply will have consequences, not just for you, but for your entire species." Derek's mind reeled at the Emperor's words. Failure to comply would have consequences for Earth, not just for him. The weight of that threat settled heavily on his shoulders. The enormity of what he had been pulled into threatened to crush him. But as he looked at the princess beside him, he saw something different in her eyes now. It wasn't just resignation, but a glimmer of understanding, like she knew he was struggling with the impossible choices placed before him. And for the first time since their handshake, Derek realized that she wasn't just a pawn in her father's game. She was trapped just like him, bound by duty and expectation. Yet, there was a quiet strength in her that Derek hadn't fully noticed before. It was there in the way she carried herself, and the way she didn't shy away from the weight of her responsibility, even though it was clear that it was tearing her apart. The Emperor's words still echoed in the air as the room remained silent, the delegates watching them both now with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Derek could feel their eyes on him, some filled with pity, some with amusement, but all of them waiting to see how this strange new alliance would unfold. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he fought, he was trapped in a game that had already been decided for him before he even set foot on this station. And the worst part was that he wasn't sure he even knew how to win, or if winning was even possible. The princess spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "You must understand that this isn't just an offer from my father. It is a command from the very heart of our culture. This union is not about you and me. It's about the future of our empire and the survival of my people. If we don't unite, if we don't bring our worlds together, there is a threat coming that we can't stop alone." Derek frowned. What was she talking about? What threat was so great that it required a human to marry the princess and father the royal heir? What was so catastrophic that the fate of two worlds was hanging in the balance? "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. "What threat is coming? And why does it have to be me? Why can't you find someone else to carry the weight of your empire's future?" The princess's eyes darkened as she took a deep breath and glanced toward her father before turning back to Derek. "It's not about finding someone else," she said quietly. "It's about the bond that was formed between us when we shook hands. It's not just a gesture of friendship. It's a link, a connection that can't be broken once it's made. It's not something we can control. And that's why you have to be part of this. The future of my people is tied to this connection." Derek felt a chill run down his spine as he processed her words. The idea of being tied to something as powerful and unchangeable as a bond created by a handshake was beyond anything he had ever imagined in his life. But what was worse was the realization that this bond wasn't just symbolic, it was real. It was something that could not be ignored or undone, no matter how much you might want to escape it. "So I'm just a piece in your game then," Derek said bitterly, his voice tight with frustration. "Just a tool to be used to secure your empire's future, and once I've played my part, I'll be discarded." The princess flinched at his words, but didn't respond right away. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if weighing whether or not to speak the truth, or to hide behind the carefully constructed facade that had been put in place by her father's commands. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, you're not just a piece of the game, Derek. You're part of something bigger than either of us. We both are, and I can't explain everything to you now. But if we don't work together, if we don't embrace what's happening between us, we won't survive what's coming." Derek stared at her, his mind swirling with questions. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand why his life had been turned upside down, why he was now standing on the precipice of a future he never asked for. But there were no easy answers, no clear path forward, just uncertainty, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would shape not just his life, but the lives of billions of people across two worlds. The Emperor's voice broke the silence once more. "The ceremony will take place soon. Preparations must begin at once. We have no time to waste." His eyes locked onto Derek's with a certainty that sent a chill through him. "You are not just a guest here, you are now part of my family, and the future of my empire rests on your shoulders, whether you accept it or not." Derek felt the weight of the Emperor's gaze settle over him like a heavy blanket, a crushing force that left no room for escape or defiance. The words echoed in his mind, part of the family future of the Empire. His stomach churned at the thought. He had no idea what to do next. All he could see was an endless path ahead with no clear direction, no escape. He was caught in a situation that seemed to have no end, no resolution. The stakes were higher than he could ever imagine, and his world had shifted from familiar to alien in the blink of an eye. But as much as he wanted to scream or run, he knew there was no way out, no way to turn back. The princess beside him stood still, her posture perfect, her face composed, yet he could see the subtle tension in her eyes, the quiet fear that had taken root there. Just like his own fear, she too was a prisoner of this tradition, of this ancient and unyielding custom. But her silence spoke volumes. It was clear that she was just as trapped by her father's demands as he was. Derek wanted to speak to her, to ask what she truly thought about all of this, but every time he tried, the words seemed to choke in his throat and fall silent. The Emperor's commanding presence hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Derek glanced at the delegates, watching them, their eyes filled with varying degrees of interest, some with fascination, others with disdain, but all of them were judging him. And in that moment, Derek knew that there was no turning back from what had just happened. The universe was watching, and he was now bound to a destiny that was not his own. He had no say in the matter, no room to change the course of his life. The princess stepped forward as if to break the silence, but her voice was soft, barely above a whisper as she spoke to him. "You should prepare yourself. The ceremony will not be simple. It will be a public declaration of our bond, and the joining of our peoples. The eyes of the entire empire will be on you." She hesitated for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. "It will be hard for you, Derek, harder than you could ever imagine, but it must be done." Derek's head spun as the enormity of her words sank in a public ceremony, the entire empire watching him, joining with her, not just as a husband, but as a symbol of unity between their worlds. He had never imagined that something as simple as a handshake would lead him here to this moment, to this alien world where the fate of two civilizations hung on the balance of their union. But what choice did he have? The Emperor had already spoken, and Derek knew that defying him would mean consequences that were far worse than anything he could fathom. He clenched his fists as he tried to steady his breath. What was he supposed to do in the face of something like this? How could he ever hope to navigate the maze of alien politics and royal expectations without losing himself in the process? He couldn't even begin to understand the culture that surrounded him or the pressures that the princess had lived under for her entire life. How was he supposed to play a role in this intricate web of power and influence when he couldn't even figure out where he fit into it all? The princess glanced at him again, her eyes filled with something almost like regret, but also determination. She seemed to be searching for something in his gaze, as if trying to gauge whether he would stand with her or turn away. "I know this is overwhelming," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with an emotion Derek couldn't place. "But this bond between us, it's not just about my father's wishes, it's about something deeper, something older than both of us. Our people have waited for this moment for generations, and it is our duty to carry it forward." Derek looked at her, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside of him. He didn't want to be a part of this. He didn't want to be forced into a marriage he hadn't asked for with a woman he barely knew. But he couldn't deny that the situation was more complex than he could have imagined. There was something at stake here that he couldn't ignore, something far bigger than his own discomfort or fear. "I didn't ask for this," Derek muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't ask to be a part of your empire or your politics." His words felt like a protest, but they were empty. He knew there was no escaping the path that had been set for him the moment his hand had touched hers, the moment the bond had been forged between them. The princess's expression softened as if she understood exactly what he was feeling, and for a brief moment, Derek saw a flicker of empathy in her eyes. "Neither of us did," she said quietly. "But it is our fate now. We will walk this path together, whether we want to or not." Derek stood there, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. His heart felt heavy as the weight of what lay ahead settled deeper into his chest. The ceremony was fast approaching, and with each passing moment, he felt more like a puppet on strings, caught in a web spun by forces far beyond his control. Every step he took seemed to lead him closer to a future that wasn't his own, a future that had been chosen for him before he even knew it was happening. But there was no escape, there was no running from this fate. It had been sealed the moment he shook hands with the princess. And yet, despite the fear and confusion swirling inside of him, there was one thing he couldn't ignore: the quiet determination that had been growing in the princess's eyes, that same determination that had been there when she first spoke of the bond between them, something that made Derek realize she wasn't just a victim in all of this, she was a partner, even if their partnership had been forced upon them. As they walked through the corridors of the Imperial Station toward the ceremonial hall, Derek felt the eyes of the Empire on them, whispers following them like a shadow. He could feel the weight of every gaze, every thought that passed between the delegates and the courtiers who watched them with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the entire galaxy were holding its breath, waiting for the moment when their futures would be forever entwined. And Derek couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would shape everything, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The princess walked beside him, her posture as regal as ever, her face a mask of calm, but Derek could see the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders were slightly tense, as though she too was trying to keep herself together in the face of what was happening around them. She had to be feeling the same pressure, the same weight of expectation, the same uncertainty. Yet she moved with the confidence of someone who had been born into this world of politics and duty, someone who had been trained for this moment her entire life, and Derek couldn't help but wonder how much of her was still left behind that mask, how much of her true self had been buried under the layers of responsibility and royal decorum. As they approached the grand ceremonial hall, the doors opened to reveal a sea of alien delegates and dignitaries, all gathered to witness the union that had been arranged between their worlds. Derek's heart pounded in his chest, his nerves threatening to consume him as he stepped into the vast chamber. The room was alive, with chatter and movement, the air thick with the scent of incense, and the sound of alien voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand. The grand hall was a breathtaking sight, with towering columns and holographic displays showcasing the beauty and power of the Empire. But none of it mattered to Derek, not in that moment, because all he could think about was the fact that he was about to become a symbol of something far beyond his comprehension, something that would forever alter his life and the life of the princess standing beside him. The Emperor stood at the center of the room waiting for them, his eyes locked onto Derek, as if he were the last piece of a puzzle that had finally fallen into place. His gaze was both welcoming and demanding a silent command that Derek knew he had no choice but to follow, and as Derek and the princess walked toward him, Derek could feel the eyes of the Empire on him, every single one of them watching him closely, waiting to see how he would react, how he would play his part in the grand spectacle that was unfolding before them. The princess spoke quietly beside him, her voice barely audible in a cacophony of noise. "Remember this, Derek. This is not just a ceremony. It is a declaration. It will bind us together in front of the entire galaxy, and there will be no turning back after this moment." Her words carried an undertone of warning, but there was something else in her voice too, a hint of something deeper, something that Derek couldn't quite place. Derek nodded, even though he wasn't sure what to expect or what he was about to face. But he knew one thing for sure: this moment would define everything. His life would never be the same again. And as he walked toward the Emperor and the waiting crowd, he took a deep breath and braced himself for what was to come, because there was no turning back now. Derek could feel the eyes of the entire galaxy on him as he stepped into the ceremonial hall. His steps felt heavy, as though the weight of every expectation, every whispered judgment, rested on his shoulders. He could hear the low hum of alien voices buzzing in the background, but all he could focus on was the princess beside him, her calm expression never wavering despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. She had done this before she was used to the pressure, but Derek was not. He had never been trained for something like this, had never imagined that he would be standing before a crowd of the most powerful beings in the galaxy to take part in a ceremony he never asked for and didn't want. As they approached the Emperor, the crowd fell silent. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps reverberating through the vast chamber. Derek could see the Emperor's expression. It was unreadable, cold, but there was a glint of something behind his eyes, something that made Derek feel like a pawn on a chessboard being maneuvered into place for a game he didn't understand and could never win. The Emperor's voice broke the silence, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Welcome guests from every corner of the galaxy. Today, we gather to witness the joining of our worlds, the union of my daughter, Princess Lyra, and this unexpected yet essential guest from Earth, Derek Bennett." His words rang out across the hall with such authority that Derek couldn't help but feel small in comparison to the power that surrounded him. The princess stood beside him, her posture impeccable, her face a picture of grace, but Derek could feel the slight tension in her movements, the way she clenched her hands at her sides, as though fighting against some unseen force. He knew she was struggling too, but there was nothing either of them could do now. They were both caught in the web of fate, spun by forces neither of them had any control over. The Emperor continued speaking, his words flowing over Derek like a wave. "This ceremony marks the beginning of a new era for our people, one that will be forged through the bond between Derek and Lyra, a bond that has been formed by destiny and strengthened by duty. Their union will bring about the survival and prosperity of our empire and ensure that the future of our civilization is secure." Derek's mind raced as the Emperor's words echoed in his ears. Survival and prosperity of their empire. That was what this union was supposed to bring about. That was the weight he was expected to carry on his shoulders, a weight he didn't ask for and didn't understand. But the Emperor's gaze was unwavering, and Derek knew that any sign of resistance would only lead to disaster for him and for Earth. The princess turned to him, then her eyes meeting his for the first time since they had entered the hall. There was something in her gaze, something soft yet intense, something that made Derek realize that despite everything they had both been forced into this moment, despite the circumstances, they shared something more than just duty. There was a connection between them, a bond that neither of them had chosen, but both of them now had to honor. "Are you ready?" she whispered to him, just loud enough for him to hear only him, the words almost lost in the noise of the crowd, but Derek felt them clearly in his chest. The simple question carried more weight than anything else he had heard all day, because in that moment he realized that he wasn't just about to participate in some grand political play, he was about to join his life to hers, whether he liked it or not. Derek's breath caught in his throat. As he looked at her, he wanted to say something, but the words felt hollow in his mind. There was no answer that would make sense, no way to explain how he felt, how wrong everything seemed, how utterly unprepared he was for this moment. But he knew there was no choice left for him. The Emperor had made it clear the entire galaxy was watching, and there was no turning back now. He nodded slowly, the motion almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The princess's lips curved into a small but meaningful smile, a smile that conveyed more than words ever could, and as the Emperor signaled for the ceremony to begin, the air seemed to crackle with energy, the weight of the moment settling over them both like a blanket too heavy to shake off. Derek's heart raced as they moved toward the altar, the Emperor's voice filling the space with words that sounded like an ancient ritual, a language Derek didn't understand. But the meaning was clear. This was it, the moment that would bind him to this world, to this princess, and to the Empire's future. No matter what he thought of it, no matter how much he wanted to escape it, his destiny was now irrevocably tied to hers, and there was no undoing it, no running away from it, no escaping the chain that had been forged between them. Derek's mind was a storm of confusion and panic as he stood at the altar beside the princess, the words of the Emperor still ringing in his ears, a weight of the ceremony pressing down on him like a physical force. It was as if the entire universe was watching them, waiting for the moment when their lives would be forever entwined, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to lose everything that had ever mattered to him, that this would be the moment when his entire identity would be swallowed up by the expectations of a people and a culture that he couldn't even begin to understand. But there was no stopping it, no way to turn back. He had stepped too far into this world to simply walk away. The princess beside him stood with perfect poise, her face a mask of composure. But Derek could see the faintest tremor in her fingers as they rested at her side, the same fear that he felt mirrored in her eyes. And for a brief moment, he wondered if she felt as trapped as he did, caught in a web of duty and tradition, with no way to escape, no way to carve out her own path. She had been born into this life, just as he had been born into his own, but now both of their destinies were locked together by forces they couldn't control. The Emperor's voice broke through his thoughts again. "Today we unite, not just as two individuals, but as representatives of our worlds together. We will forge an alliance that will ensure the survival of both our civilizations." His tone was filled with the authority of someone who believed deeply in the importance of this moment. Derek wanted to scream, to tell him that he wasn't part of this plan, that he wasn't ready for this, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, as though the air itself was being sucked out of the room. The princess turned to him, then her eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion that made his heart race. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him spoke volumes. She was giving him a chance to back out, a chance to show that he wasn't going to fall into line without a fight. But Derek couldn't bring himself to move, to speak the words of defiance that were burning inside him, because deep down he knew that there was no fight to be won, no way to push back against the tide of history that was carrying them both forward into a future they couldn't control. The Emperor's voice continued to echo through the hall. "You will take the oath now, Derek Bennett, and pledge your loyalty to the Empire and to my daughter for the future of all that we hold dear." The words felt like chains being forged around his wrists, binding him to a world he didn't belong to. And as Derek stood there before the gathered delegates, his thoughts spun in circles, his mind racing to find some way out of the trap he had found himself in. But there was no escape, no backdoor, no way to undo the bond that had already been formed between him and the princess. He glanced at her once more and saw the same quiet resolve in her eyes that he had seen earlier, but this time there was something else there too, something softer, something almost human. And in that moment, Derek realized that she wasn't just a figurehead in this grand political game. She wasn't just an object to be used to secure an alliance. She was real. She had her own hopes and dreams, her own desires, even if they were buried deep beneath the layers of duty and responsibility that had been thrust upon her. The moment passed too quickly for Derek to truly grasp it before the Emperor's eyes locked onto him again with an intensity that made Derek's blood run cold. "Take the oath now," the Emperor said, his voice cold and final. Derek stood there in the silence that followed, unsure of what to do, unsure of what was expected of him. His mind was numb, his body stiff. But somehow he found the strength to open his mouth and speak the words that were expected of him, even though every fiber of his being screamed against it. "I pledge my loyalty to the Empire and to Princess Lyra for the future of all that we hold dear." The words felt like they were being ripped from him. His heart felt heavy as the Emperor nodded approvingly, and the room erupted into applause. Derek couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. All he could hear was the sound of the crowd around him, the clapping, the cheering, the noise of a celebration that he didn't feel a part of, as the princess smiled beside him, her face a picture of grace. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something inside of him had just died, that he had just sold a piece of his soul to a world that would never be his own. As the applause continued, the Emperor stepped forward and placed a hand on Derek's shoulder, the weight of it a physical reminder of the bond they had just forged. "You have done well, Derek Bennett," the Emperor said, his voice low, but filled with approval. "The future of both our worlds rests in your hands now." Derek's heart pounded in his chest as the Emperor's words echoed in his ears. The weight of the Emperor's hand on his shoulder felt like a final judgment, a seal on a fate he never asked for but now had no choice but to face. The applause from the crowd felt distant, hollow, as though he were watching someone else live his life. He could feel the eyes of every delegate in the room on him, the weight of their gaze pressing down like a physical force that made it hard to breathe. Yet all he could think about was the princess standing beside him, her calm exterior a facade. He couldn't quite figure out what she was thinking, what she was feeling behind that mask of composure. But there was something there in her eyes, something that spoke of shared understanding, a silent bond forged between them by this forced union. The Emperor stepped back, his hand dropping from Derek's shoulder as he turned to the crowd, his voice booming out once more. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in the history of our empire and our alliance with the humans of Earth. We will stand united as one people in the face of all challenges that come our way, and through this union, we would ensure the prosperity of both our worlds." His words were met with more applause, but Derek barely heard it. His thoughts were a whirlwind, his mind unable to quiet the storm of confusion and dread that raged within him. He glanced at the princess again, their eyes meeting for the briefest moment, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in her gaze, something that wasn't duty or expectation. It was a glimmer of vulnerability that struck him deeply. Beneath all the royal decorum, beneath the mask of the princess, was a person just like him, a person who had been thrust into a world of expectations and responsibility neither of them had chosen, neither of them wanted, but now both of them had to live with. The Emperor's voice cut through his thoughts again, this time addressing them directly. "The next step in this process will be the formal recognition of your bond in front of the entire empire. We will hold a celebration in your honor to mark the beginning of your new life together." His tone was filled with finality, and Derek knew that there was no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. The ceremony had begun, and it would continue until the Emperor had seen his vision fulfilled. Derek felt a knot form in his stomach as the reality of his situation settled in. He was now a part of this empire, a part of its future, whether he liked it or not. And as much as he wanted to fight back, to resist it, he knew that there was no way to undo what had been done, no way to erase the bond that had been forged between him and the princess, no way to turn back the clock to the moment before everything had changed. He looked at the princess again and saw the same quiet determination in her eyes that had been there when they first entered the hall. She wasn't backing down, she wasn't running from this, and somehow that gave Derek a strange sense of comfort, as if he wasn't alone in this struggle, as if there was someone else who understood the enormity of what they were facing. She stepped closer to him, then her voice low just for him to hear. "We have to do this, Derek, for both of our worlds, for the future of everything that depends on us." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Derek couldn't ignore. She was right. They had to do this. They had to follow through with the Emperor's plan, because the consequences of failure were too great to imagine. Derek took a deep breath as he nodded, silently acknowledging the truth of her words, and for the first time since he had been brought into this alien world, he felt a strange sense of acceptance. He didn't want this, he didn't ask for this, but he had made a promise, a pledge, that he couldn't take back, and if he had to walk this path, then he would do it with the princess by his side. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, because that was all they had left now. The future was no longer theirs to choose, but at least they could face it together. The Emperor smiled then, a knowing smile that spoke volumes as he watched them. "This union will bring great things for both our worlds," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Now let us begin the next phase of our journey, the journey that will shape the future of our empire and your future together." And as the Emperor's words settled over them, Derek felt the weight of everything that was to come, the weight of the future, resting squarely on his shoulders. But in that moment he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone in it. The princess was with him, and together they would find a way to navigate the challenges that lay ahead.